All right, cool. We are live. Um, all right. Well, Joe, do you want to bring us in? I've been bringing us in recently.
Yeah, welcome everyone to Inside the Cylinder, episode 80?
2.
82. That's my guy. Post draft episode here. We do have a guest along with us.
Brady
Let's
Fredrickson.
restart that. Let's restart that.
Didn't know
My
his
man
last
caught me
name.
off guard. I don't
Yeah,
think I
no.
brought us in for like 40 episodes.
All right, I got us. So we can go now. All right. Well, Joe just had a valiant attempt to bring us in, but I'm gonna take the reins here. This is Inside the Cylinder. One of your go-to Detroit Pistons podcasts. We're on DetroitBadBoys.com. As well as anywhere else you can find your podcast. Joined as always by my co-host Joey Mack. What's up, Joe?
What's up, David? How we doing?
Good, man. Ready to get into this, but we're also joined by Detroit Bad Boys' own Brady Fredrickson. Welcome to the podcast, Brady. First time guest.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me on.
Of course. And that I said your last name correctly, right?
Yeah, you got close enough. I mean, it can be said a million ways. As long as you get it ballpark, we're good.
All right, cool. Well, apologies if your grandpa's listening in or something, and I just insulted the family name. But you want to tell them where they can find you and everything, Brady?
As you said, I'm DetroitBadBoys.com. Twitter at Brady_Fred, and in Charleston, South Carolina, if you're ever here. But that's kind of TMI. So
I love what is it? The like the dock area, or not the dock, but it's kind of like a boardwalk area in Charleston. Is that right?
it's the Battery.
The Battery. It's
the Battery. Big old Civil War place, a lot of Confederate statues and stuff, and a lot of big Northeastern money. It's a pretty hoity-toity part of town, but it's definitely it's definitely what makes Charleston.
Okay, so I would maybe cringe a little bit at certain things, and then I was there when I was like 13. So, but I remember it being beautiful.
The houses are really nice, yeah, for sure.
Cool. Well, welcome into. We're here, obviously joined by the internet. I'm in Boston. Joe's in Chicago. And yeah, we're here to talk about a little bit about the draft recap. This is the draft recap episode and kind of a free agency primer. I don't think Joe and I are going to have time to actually do a pre-free agency full episode. But we did want to talk a little bit about some of the moves that Detroit has made, prior to the draft and then during the draft, and kind of just digest everything that happened, because to be honest with you, my head's still kind of spinning from everything that happened in the draft in general. But, prior to, Detroit did make a move where they traded John Lure and the $9.5 million he was owed this season for Tony Snell of the Milwaukee Bucks in the 30th pick in the draft. I guess, Brady, since, you're joining us here first, I want to kick it to you first. What are your thoughts on Tony Snell? I guess on the trade in general, and Tony Snell as a player in Detroit.
I think it's a trade that doesn't necessarily hurt. I mean, the Pistons didn't even have a small forward for the better part of their kind of playoff push last year, and Tony Snell's a guy who definitely fits that mold physically. I think he's 6'7". He's got like a 7-foot wingspan, and he's an adequate defender who can make threes at like a 40% clip. And they had nobody like that on the team this year or last year or the year before that. And so I don't think he's a perfect player. I think there's a lot of flaws to his game, and I don't think he's a long-term answer. But for a team that's kind of trying to compete, it has, the option to have a player who's going to step into their probably starting lineup and fill a role that they desperately need, versus a guy in John Lure who, outside of 40 odd games his first year in Detroit, has really been kind of a disaster on the court, despite what the analytics say. I mean, it's a no-brainer from that perspective, but how Tony Snell plays and how that's viewed will kind of, dictate how this trade goes, because Tony Snell could just go out and be terrible, and then somehow trading away John Lure looks bad.
Yeah, when you have the second year of Tony Snell's $12.2 million, you got to stomach that one, even if he's not playing well. Yeah, and I think that's something that I noted. I think we wrote about it for Detroit Bad Boys in the DB Beyond 3. Is that I know that Detroit was able to scoop a first rounder, or at least a first round pick, which they end up moving. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But, all in all, like Tony Snell, it's a terrible contract when you look at it in the value of his production, what he's been able to do in small sample sizes and large sample sizes. I think in general, he fits the need that you mentioned. Like, it was pretty futile watching the first round of the playoffs specifically. And even the end of the season last year, where Detroit was rolling out, the two shooting guards for the 2 and 3 spot, and they were just clearly outmatched, undersized, and it was just, they looked futile, honestly, on defense against a lot of like the top tier teams. So I understand it from that perspective. And in a positive note, like you mentioned it, Brady, like you were literally, John Lure had lost so much trust, not only from like the coaches and the fans in the city, but like he looked like he lost trust in himself. So he was really pretty much a non-factor out there on the floor. So, I mean, to get anything for his contract, I thought that was a positive. And then they also were able to get that first round pick, which they ended up moving. But, for me, I thought it was a win in like a small like vacuum that is very particular to the Detroit Pistons situation right now.
And
Joe, do you have any? Oh,
well,
sorry. Go ahead, Brady.
One note about Tony Snell, and the thing about him and the way that the Pistons kind of have utilized their wings. And I think of Wayne Ellington when I think of this as, you take guys and you try and put them in position where they're doing what they're best at. And obviously we saw this year in the, half a season of games. I mean, Wayne Ellington is in the NBA because he shoots threes. And there's no reason to have him do anything else but put him in position to shoot threes. And Tony Snell, if you go back to his time in Chicago versus his time in Milwaukee, his role was different, obviously. He probably got better over that period of time too, but he shot very few shots inside the arc in Milwaukee, whereas he was shooting like 5-6 times inside the arc in Chicago. And his last year in Chicago, his 2-point field goal percentage was 38%, which is pathetic, like unbelievably pathetic. So as long as Dwayne Casey finds a way for him to just stand in the corner and chuck up 4 or 5 threes a game, they'll be fine. But if that, you still get into other problems that the Pistons have had, which is that nobody on the wing can dribble or do anything with the ball except for Luke Kennard. But that's another story.
Yeah, Joe, I know you're a Chicago guy yourself. Did you have any thoughts about Tony Snell, either residual thoughts about him as a player from his days in Chicago, or in general just for him, and how you see him in Detroit right now?
I think you pretty much know what you're getting with Tony Snell. His stats from last season were pretty much on par with his stats over the course of his career. So he averages right around 6 points a game, shoots right around 45% from the field, in the high 30s, 38, 39% from 3, 2 rebounds a game. I mean, across the board, his stats are pretty much the same, between last season and the rest of his career. So I think for the most part, we know what we're going to get. And I think Brady makes a really good point. I mean, I think we really do just need to maximize the strengths that he has. And that main strength is 3-point shooting and hopefully, an above average guy on defense. And it does fill a void at the small position. So player for player, he's a guy that can actually make some sort of an impact, whether or not that's minimal is to be determined. But what we did know is that John Lure was not going to make an impact. And that was pretty clear last season. He's not a young guy. He's coming off of injuries. The shot wasn't there. And as you mentioned, I mean, he just overall looked uncomfortable. So I think that, it's hard to say that getting rid of John Lure and getting any player and a first round pick in return is a bad trade. Obviously, he only has 1 year left. We're going to have to eat some money on this. But, I think at the very least, we got a backup small forward, a position that we desperately need to figure out. I would have concern with him being our starting small forward. But overall, great trade. And he brings an aspect in 3-point shooting that we desperately need to improve upon.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think he's going to start. I don't really know who else the Detroit is going to be. I mean, they could essentially target another small forward in free agency. I think at least the optics of this trade from afar is that Detroit has figured out their starting small forward moving forward, and now they have at least a little limited cap space to target a backup point guard, to target a backup center, other positions of need that are pretty clear for this team. So the one thing that does concern me with Tony Snell, and it's not necessarily about Tony Snell as much as it is about what we've seen recently for guys that shoot threes on like a smaller sample size once they get to Detroit, is that their 3-point shooting has just fallen off of a cliff. Like when you look at Jose Calderon last year, I think he was like 49%. Now he was playing alongside LeBron James the year before that, but still, he had open looks, plenty of open looks in Detroit. You look at Glenn Robinson III, another guy that you brought in to be a defensive, not necessarily a stopper, but an adequate three and a guy that can hit corner threes. And he's another guy that had very small sample size, but had a respectful shooting clip from three, and that fell off the cliff. So, and those guys were both on minimum. So, or not necessarily Glenn Robinson III, but not nearly the cap hit that you're seeing with Tony Snell. So if his 3-point shooting falls off the cliff, and then he's also unplayable at a certain point, then that's really when this trade is going to be looking pretty poor for Detroit after next season. Once you do have another year of Tony Snell with $12.2 million owed to him. So that's just like this like underlying fear, just because I've seen it happen before.
I think that within that, though, you're right. There is that feeling that everybody who comes to Detroit just magically forgets how to shoot. And it started with like Ben Gordon and went to Jody Meeks for the first year he was there, and kind of just continued to push on. But I think at the same time, you look at Glenn Robinson III, for example, and I think Jose Calderon just caught a case of being old, and that kind of was what did it to him. But at the same time with like Glenn, I think he just was a guy who had, you talk about sample size. I mean, I'm sure Tony Snell, even last year, taking 204 threes, probably Glenn Robinson III probably hasn't attempted 204 threes in the last 2.5 seasons, or maybe has total in that span. So, I mean, Tony Snell's a guy who's been shooting 250 to 350 threes a season. So, I mean, your sample size is a little better there, I think. He's not quite as much of an enigma, I think, as Glenn Robinson III was. More of a what if, as like maybe Glenn will be good, and it turns out he's not good. But we all hoped that when he arrived last summer.
Yeah, no, I agree. That makes sense. You're right. I think that at that point, when Glenn Robinson III showed up in Detroit, he had shot like 300 threes for his career, because he didn't get playing time when he started off in the league. He had injuries, so he didn't get playing time. Then he had like one really strong season in Indiana, and then he got injured again. I don't really remember the full trajectory of his career, but I remember it was like very spotty in the moments when he would get playing time. So, hopefully with Tony Snell, he's just going to do what he can do, or what we think he can do: guard threes, shoot corner threes, shoot open threes. And Detroit did generate a pretty solid offense in the ability to generate those open looks from three. So hopefully with Snell, he'll actually be able to find the bottom of the bucket. But any last thoughts on Tony Snell as a player, or anything that anyone has? No?
He's just a guy.
Yeah, he's a dude. So should we move on to the first round pick? Get our Siku on? I say we do it.
Is it Siku or Seku? How do we pronounce his name? Do we know that for sure?
Joe and I were talking about
Saku. So what about his last name? I've been going Dumboya. I believe that's what I heard from Chauncey Billups on stage during the draft, but I don't know if I want to believe what comes out of his mouth during the draft, because I don't know that he was fully paying attention on Thursday night. But
I thought it was Buyumba, but I could also be incorrect here as well. Joe, did you have it down?
Yeah, Dumboya.
That sounds right. I love that we're not going to know how to pronounce this kid's name until like at least 2021.
He's going to be a first name guy for us. Like, he's Ariana right now. So,
or
you're not
going
to go
like a nickname guy like Giannis.
Yeah,
if he's that good.
Oh, here's
the French freak.
Here's the NBA pronunciation guide real quick. Seku, Dembuya. So Dembuya. Booyah like Stuart Scott. I got it. We're good. Let's do this.
Okay.
I love the clarity.
So I guess, so essentially the Pistons picked him up at 15. And depending on who you listen to, who you value as the draft experts, whatever that necessarily means, he was projected to be a lottery pick. Mind you, a lottery pick is one pick before Detroit. So, there's still, I guess, the grade is out when it comes to, or what I'm trying to say is that, who knows where he was actually valued from these teams. Detroit had mentioned that they had figured that he was like a top 5 or top 6 pick on their big board, but you hear that from teams all the time that they really found the guy and that the guy fell to them. So I think that you can like push that narrative to where, you had to select this guy, even if, the rest of the NBA might not have been as high on him. But in general, I mean, I think the what I've seen from most outlets was that he did fall to Detroit. Is that what you guys were seeing as well?
Yeah, what I saw is he was a projected top 10 pick, and a lot of people expected him to go number 9 to the Wizards. And I was listening to Ed Stefanski talk about like how all of the dominoes fell, and he was essentially saying that there were several teams, based on what he's heard, that were back and forth between Sekou and another player, and pretty much every single one of all those teams went with the other player. So he was kind of a 1A, 1B guy, and we got lucky, and those teams drafted somebody else, and he just fell into our laps at 15.
Yeah.
No, yeah, I think you're right. Washington was kind of the spot for him. At the same time, you look at where that draft kind of got wonky was around Washington because it's a team that's drafting without any sort of permanent front office. And so Rui Hachimura goes there. So that's kind of the opposite of Sekou, which is, a low ceiling, kind of high floor guy. And then you get to Cam Johnson at Phoenix and everything's wonky at that point. I think those two picks were the reason he fell to 15 because it kind of just the natural motion where guy sneaks up, someone's got to sneak back down. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean that's that's how I had viewed it. And I remember before the draft happened, we were talking about it internally at Detroit Bad Boys, and I know Sean, the lead editor over at Detroit Bad Boys, the site expert, was huge on the Sekou train. He was the one where, as soon as Detroit made the pick, I was like, all right, he wasn't necessarily the guy that I had circled. Mind you, this was one of the drafts where I felt like I knew the least going in over the past like 4 or 5 years. And that's not only because that everybody didn't know what was going on. It's because I like particularly did not pay as much attention as I normally do to the draft stuff and to, college basketball this past year. So I mean, I was happy just from just looking at it from afar, and there's still a lot to be decided. But were there any players that either that Detroit had passed on or that were selected maybe prior to Detroit that you thought were going to be there at 15 or that were there at 15 that you were really hoping that Detroit was going to select, where that they ended up going with Sekou in general? Brady, was there a player that you had that comes to mind? Excuse me.
I had gone back and forth on so many guys because, like you said, you pay attention to college basketball, but then you try and think about like need versus, potential and whatnot. And so Sekou was a guy who I knew I didn't think there was a chance he was going to be there because it seemed like the top, foreign unknown type prospect is always one who somebody falls in love with really high. So I was like, well, Sean may like him, but I'm not really thinking he'll be there. I did not want Tyler Hero because I think he's redundant with the roster. And the guy I kind of was falling for a little bit was Goga. I don't even know how to say his last name. Bitadze, the kid from Georgia, the big center who kind of has a little bit of a stroke from 3. And I thought that'd be a good pick because they're going to obviously have to go find a center this summer to back up Drummond and hopefully play next to Blake when Drummond's not in there, and maybe even find ways to go Twin Towers with Drummond out there. But I thought he could fit. And then if Andre leaves in a year or two, then boom, we've got a guy who can step right in. So I was coming around on that pick. And then I kind of went back on it at the last second. And as I was watching, I'm kind of like, well, Nikhil Alexander-Walker fits a need. He's a great passer. He's a good shooter. He's tough because everybody who goes to Virginia Tech is just hard-nosed. And that seems like it would fit the culture and whatnot. So, I mean, those 3 were the kind of the ones I was looking at, or those 2 specifically. And then Saku drops. And at that point, I was like, well, I think that's who they're going to take. And the main thing I just remember is when Boston took Romeo Langford, I just was like, thank God. And I think you liked Romeo Langford a little bit, David, but I was like, get him away from the team. I do not want another, not that athletic wing who can't shoot. I've been there, done that. On to the next one. And so I was pretty happy that they got Saku at 15.
Yeah, I was
Go
actually
ahead,
high
David.
on Romeo Langford, and I wanted him at 15. So I was a bit bummed out that the Celtics took him at 14. And I think he's pretty redundant on the Celtics. I mean, I guess they just stash young guys and figure out the rest. But yeah, I was hoping he'd fall to 15. And Saku wasn't even on my radar. Like, I hadn't watched his tape. I didn't know what he looked like. I heard rumors of comparisons to Pascal Siakam, which always get blown out of proportion. But like, at the end of the day, his dimensions are identical. Like, his length, his wingspan, his overall game, his athleticism is extremely similar. And obviously Pascal's just like a hot name right now due to the fact that the Raptors just won the NBA championship. But yeah, I mean, he was just he was a foreign player that, like, you don't really know. Like, I don't know how to I don't know how to scout those guys. So then after we drafted him, I watched his pro day, and I came around significantly. But anyways, in regards to like where we were at with the 15th pick, wanted Romeo, was interested in Darius Bazley, because at that point in time it was pretty clear that he wasn't going to fall to us at 30, although that's ultimately where I wanted to pick him up. And then Nasir Little was another guy who I was strongly interested in as well. So he was ultimately after Romeo Langford went. I was also at a bar, like, drinking with coworkers, so I wasn't like seriously in tune with who's still on the board and like all of the details on the draft. So I didn't have the down low on Saku that I wish I would have. But I'm so excited that he fell to us at 15, and I don't think the dominoes could have fallen better for us at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, I can kind of mirror that sentiment, because I was like back and forth in the guys that I wanted to target. I eventually fell on Romeo Langford because I was maybe foolishly, I mean, we'll see, buying into the narrative that, he was a good shooter coming out of high school. He was known to be a shooter. I did like his ability to slash, to get into the paint, and to get to the free throw line. That's just something that Detroit has been lacking so badly when it comes to their wing play. I was a little concerned in like his physical stature, because he's another 6'6" guy on the roster, although he does have, I believe, a 6'11" wingspan in Romeo Langford. But then when I saw that Detroit, like, immediately after picked Saku, and just kind of seeing all the hype that I was seeing the week going into the draft, and he looked like a guy that, to me, I believe everything that I was reading, was climbing in the mock drafts, and then also the hype that Sean had been kind of going over, and just the sort of the banter, the back and forth that we had within Detroit Bad Boys chat. That just made me like outwardly like, okay, I should be excited about this guy. And then when I was able to actually watch some of his tape, watch some of his scouting reports, and it was very clear to me that it's not necessarily like the player that I wanted. It was, I wanted Detroit to take a swing on a high upside wing. Like, that is what the profile that I wanted from Detroit. And that's exactly what they did. Like, Saku's ceiling is extremely high. He was the youngest player in the draft. He's been playing professionally in France since he was 15 years old. Hypothetically speaking, he's a guy that could possibly guard 4 positions on the floor. In watching some of his tape, he looked good defensively. He had like some natural shot blocking ability, some natural help side defense. So there was a lot of elements where it was like, okay, I didn't know a lot about this guy, but had I done my proper research and then the Pistons had drafted him, I would have been as excited as I am now that we do have the player. We can project what his career might be in Detroit. So from like a profile perspective, he is the type of player. And from a body perspective, 6'9" with a 6'11" wingspan and 230 pounds, like, that is ideally what I wanted for Detroit. So there's so much positive that came immediately after. Like, the day or two after the draft, once I was able to do more of a deep dive, that looking back on it, I'm extremely happy that Detroit was able to make this selection.
And I think I think people kind of always, and I think in Detroit specifically, and it's just residual, and it's not just people who are, fans of the team in 2003, but like the Darko thing, still to this day, kind of has some sort of a shadow over people's opinion of foreign players in the draft. And I understand it, I suppose, to a point, just because of the magnitude of that mess up. But I mean, this is a guy who, in Saku, I mean, he averaged 8 points per game in the top level of professional league in France. I mean, I don't know how you want to compare that to college basketball, but I mean, there are surely 15 good teams in that league, and there are all better than most of the middling teams in like the Big Ten. So, I mean, I would imagine he would have been like one of those guys who's like a 14, 15 point per game guy if he played college basketball over here. And with his size and his speed and his, athleticism and all of the stuff that makes him such an interesting prospect. I mean, if you had brought him over here and played him in college basketball, I'm sure he would have been a guy who, caught people's eye and would have probably, been that high pick if they could say, well, we saw him score 25 points against Minnesota back in December, which, that doesn't matter outside of the fact that it like makes your eye test feel like you've seen him do something. But I mean, I don't know. It's different than like even Giannis a couple of years ago, who was playing in like a very low level. That's a much riskier thing than Saku playing in, a top level division over there.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. Go ahead, Joe. Sorry.
No, I was just gonna say, I think the really interesting thing about this pick is it's a glimpse into potential life after like Blake Griffin and Andre Drummond. So it's clearly not a compete now move, although he could potentially help us on defense 10 minutes a game in the next 2 or so years. But he's only 18 years old, and he could, make more of an impact in 3 or so years on the floor. And he could be the guy if things don't start to make sense next year, after like post Blake Griffin era. So I think that's where, like, at least for me, that's where a lot of the excitement comes, is it's not make or break with our current lineup necessarily. We can compete, right? We're not going to win the championship this year or next year, but we can at the very least compete for the next couple of years. And then after that period of time is over with, we have a couple of young pieces that can help us in the future. Now, there's a lot of things that have to happen between now and then. He needs to build an NBA body. He needs to work on his handles. Like, he's so young that there's a lot that needs to happen for his game to develop. But all of the, everything's there. He has the motor. He can play defense. So I think that with player development, that this is a guy that at the very least can be a difference maker, on defense, and can cause some problems with mismatches on offense. And I think that's his absolute floor.
Yeah, I think another positive that I take away just from the organization from like a high level is that Detroit has they have appeared to invest into player development, which you could not have said, 5 years ago, 3 years ago, even. Detroit really does seem to have, tried to acquire the staff when it comes to Dwayne Casey. He was a guy that, mentored Pascal Siakam, that turned around Kyle Lowry's career. He's a guy that, and then also Sean Sweeney, the Giannis whisperer from Milwaukee, is on the staff. There's pieces in play right now, and a track record, a small track record, when you look at a player like Bruce Brown, who, there's definitely holes in his game, but he did start for, 60, 50 plus some odd games, and was a starter in the playoff rotation. There's and he was a second round pick. So there's elements here where it's like, okay, I really see what Detroit is trying to do. And I understand that they're going, the long road here with this pick, at least for when it comes to like Saku's like absolute top, what he might be able to provide while in a Pistons uniform, seeing how he is so young. But I think he is going to have opportunity to play, opportunity to develop, and an opportunity to, contribute on this team in areas where Detroit needs him now. So I don't necessarily think he's going to be a guy where, you just see him sitting on the end of the bench the entire season. I do believe that there's going to be chances for him to get a little bit of run in Detroit. Just because, frankly, this team still isn't very good, and they're still very shallow when it comes to the small forward position. So I don't really see a reason why you can't at least give him a few minutes, here and there going once you're ingrained into the season, and just to see what he has, because, the stroke looks good. He can push it in transition. He's athletic, and he's got a lot to figure out, but I don't think he'd be like a non-factor out there, or a complete wash, in the 5 minutes a game that you might throw him at some point this season.
I think when we talk about him as a small forward, which is, obviously that's what you want him to be because that's what the team needs the most. But Pascal Siakam, which you guys kind of mentioned, it's kind of a lazy comparison just because of the, both guys, from overseas, and both guys are big, long, that type of a player. But if you look at the Pistons bench last year, when they got into positions where, Blake was off the floor, essentially you're stuck playing Thon Maker at power forward. And Thon obviously has some redeeming traits, but more often than not, he doesn't really know what he's doing out there. And he doesn't have the athleticism to keep up with like a team that goes small and plays like a tweener small forward, power forward at the 4 spot. So I think Saku's a guy who you could put out there, and his athleticism at least gives you a chance to chase around a guy who's going to shoot threes at the 4. Whereas if you put Thon out there at the 4 with Andre, you've got 2 guys who have no comfort coming out of the paint, which leaves you to just give up a lot of open shots and gives up, a lot of space because those guys aren't comfortable stepping out.
Yeah, I'm still not completely not sold on Thon Maker. I still think that there's quite a bit of room for improvement for him too. So I think that he's going to rightfully come off the bench as a backup 4. Now, trust me, I watched the same stuff that you watch. I watched the same games that you watched, and I watched the futility that was Thon Maker at times. But at the same time, I think that there's still a player there, and but I don't know. I guess some of the reason why I do make the Pascal comparison, and it partly is because it's been spoon fed to me. Another part is because when I watched some of his tape, like his pushing the floor, his transition game, and just his like athleticism, his build does like actually remind me of a Pascal Siakam. He doesn't necessarily have like a crazy get by your man type of handles and speed, but he's got the shot. He's got, I don't know, there's just elements of his game that really do remind me of a player, and maybe it's because I can't think of another player that played more recently that reminds me of Pascal's game. But in general, that's kind of why I'm making that comparison, just because it just reminded me of that when I watched the tape so far. I don't know, Joe.
Yeah, no, well, it's a perfect comparison. That's the thing. It makes sense. They have the same length. They have similar games. Is he going to get to that point in his career? Who knows? What is Pascal Siakam ceiling? We don't know yet. He's still a pretty young guy. So I think that's based on the fact that Dwayne Casey coached Pascal, and the fact that they have such similar bodies in games. I think that's a decent blueprint to go off of. But I do think that it's important that he gets minutes year one. I was listening to Laz's podcast, and he was saying that he could visualize Saku in like Stanley Johnson's role last year before he got traded, like kind of like 15 spark minutes. I'm not sure I can necessarily picture that. I tend to agree with Brady. Like, I think that he could push Thon and compete with Thon for backup 4 minutes, and he can win minutes based off of that, and then potentially get some minutes at the 3 as well, because we're obvious. The thing about it is we're so thin at the 2 positions that he plays. I guess the jury's out whether or not he can actually, keep up with a lot of threes in the NBA, but that's sort of where his game is at, a hybrid 3-4. So he can fill some gaps that we have that are open at this point in time, and he can compete with guys because we don't have much talent in those areas. So I think he can definitely earn some minutes year one.
Yeah, I don't mean to go too much down the road on like the 3 or 4. I mean, how much does Thon Maker weigh, by the way?
I think I have it pulled up right now. Hang on. They list him at 7'1", 221, which he's probably
insane.
gained 20 pounds since he was drafted. So that kind of probably makes sense.
Wow. Yeah. Cause I mean, and it's kind of tough to find like the measurements on the guys that were just drafted. Cause I saw so many different numbers that I just went with the one that I believed the most when I listed Saku at 6'9", with a 6'11" wingspan and 230 pounds. So, I mean, maybe, you're right, Brady, that he will be able to take some more of the punishment, because that's really where Thon was he looked futile. Like, I don't really know.
He was
he just got thrown around down there. And, but it was a scenario where, especially because there were moments where he had to play backup 5 as well, because John Lore couldn't play the backup 5. And then Zaza was just getting dunked on by Mitchell Robinson 15 times in a row. So you had to put somebody out there that could actually move their feet. So, I guess I could see a scenario like that. I haven't really thought about like that, because I've just been like, oh my God, did we get our 3 of the future? That I haven't like thought about him too much as before. But I don't need to. I mean, it's a position. It's becoming more and more of a positionless league. But I mean, I guess before we go too much further down the wormhole, should we
move
on to the trade scenario that followed the Saku pick, or does anybody have any backup?
I have one more Saku thing. So just to go back on that Siakam thing with Saku. So Pascal Siakam, what is he, about a 17.7 rebound per game guy? Obviously a very, very good player, the most improved player, in fact. But he's 25 years old. He's like 7 years older than Saku. So not to say that Saku is close to him now. I don't think he is. But like over the next 7 years, like that's a long time if you think about it. I mean, Pascal Siakam didn't come to America until he was 20, I believe, or 22. And he played 2 years at New Mexico State until he
3 years at New Mexico State.
Okay, yeah. And I mean, even there, his freshman year at New Mexico State, he averages 13.7 rebounds as like a 21 or 22-year-old. Meanwhile, Saku's playing professional ball overseas, which that league I can guarantee is 100% better than the West Coast or whatever, the Western Athletic Conference, wherever New Mexico State plays. And so I just think that, like, and obviously the growth that Siakam showed over the last 3 years is pretty astonishing, considering he went from being a 0% shooter pretty much in college to being a good one now. But I just think that, like, Saku has so much room to grow, and there's so much time for him to grow. You get to a point with prospects, and I think we got there with Stanley Johnson, and I think Thon Maker's there too, where guys get to be like 22, 23, 24, and it's like, well, they are what they are at this point. Like, there's really not much of a chance that this guy blossoms. But, with Saku, you've got at least 4 years until you get to even 22, where you're thinking, well, it's been, almost 350 NBA games. He's still blah, 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 blah. So I just think there's so much room for him to grow. And like, if he doesn't end up doing anything this year, which I don't expect, but I think, taking into account that age and comparing him to the guys that people compare him to, like, you have to just kind of have perspective with that, because, even guys like Pascal Siakam were bad when they came into the league, and he was 3 years or 4 years older than Saku is now.
I dig the optimism. I had written down as well that I have Saku as a guy that could possibly become like a 20 point per game type of scorer. I think that he has that many different elements to his game, at least in like the bits and pieces that I've been able to watch so far, where, especially if his 3-point shooting, and he wasn't like terrible. He wasn't like a 24% 3-point shooter in France. In 39 games played last year, he shot 31% from 3. It's a deeper arch than there is in college basketball. So I think that there's definitely something there. His shot doesn't look broken. It actually looks pretty good. So, I agree with you, Brady. I think that there's the ceiling could possibly be higher, but also, I do want to temper my thoughts just because he is so young, and that could become a tricky scenario for Detroit down the road, especially knowing paydays, if you are that young, also come when you're younger. So you have to be almost a little bit more bullish or defiant in how you feel about a guy with contracts, looming, not necessarily right now since he hasn't even played a game yet, but just projecting down the road. I know that that's one of the things I've seen in the draft grades is that, hey, you might have gotten yourself a really good player, Detroit, but, he's so young that he might find himself as a better player for another team. So, that's something that I'm trying to stifle, internally, but at the same time that has been, it's a slight concern, but not a real concern just because, he hasn't played a game yet. There's something I wanted to note.
I have one question back for you guys. This will transition us beyond here, but I know you talked about it when you talked to me earlier about this. So, we talked about the guys that we wanted at that pick and, the kind of array of guys, and nobody mentioned Brandon Clark from Gonzaga, the other big man. And I know that was a guy specifically throughout, like, Pistons fans on Twitter and stuff, that people were like, why didn't you take him? Why didn't you take him? And he's kind of the opposite of Sakua in that he's 23 years old and he's not a small forward. He's definitively a post, and he's big and he's muscly and he's fully developed. Do you guys think that a player like that would have fit better on this team, considering they're basically in win now mode, even if they won't admit it?
You go ahead, Joe. Sorry.
No, he would have helped more next year in the following year. I think he's going to be 23 before this season starts. So he's by no means a finished product, but he's pretty near to the player that you would expect him to be for the foreseeable future in the NBA. I was meh on him. Like, I would have been fine if we would have drafted him, but it wouldn't have been like a draft pick that would have stuck out to me and caused like crazy optimism in my eyes. We need a backup 4 clearly, and we also need a backup 5. I think he could play like backup 4 and be, somewhat of a rim protector, but I think that NBA teams will find a way to get him away from the rim at the 4 position and exploit, some of his deficiencies and not allow him to just be like strictly a rim protector. So like, I just don't really see the overall fit with the Pistons like down the road 5 or 6 years. Although he does fill an area of need for them next year. So I'd have been okay with it, but like ultimately I wanted a guy with a higher, I guess, long-term upside and more of just like a future in general, like a younger guy that we could, develop him within our system. So if we would have drafted him, I would have been okay with it, but he was by no means the guy that I was like zeroing in on.
Yeah, and for me, I really wanted Detroit to draft that type of profile, the profile of a high upside guy, not a guy that was not a quote unquote like safe pick. I was kind of happy that Cam Johnson got selected where he did, where Detroit wasn't forced to make that decision, not only because of injury history, but just because like he's going to be like 24 in like 6 months or something. Like he is by far, he was the oldest player in the draft, and I just didn't want to see, even though he would have fit better tomorrow in Detroit, that isn't the profile that I want, because I'm also on the same sort of mindset of that Joe had mentioned earlier. It's like you do have to start thinking about either the later stages of the Blake career in Detroit or the after stage of the Blake career in Detroit. So I was happy that Detroit drafted the type of profile I wanted, and I am stoked about Siku.
No, I think you're both right. I think he fits a need right now, but I think at the same time too, just comparing, quality of opponents, Gonzaga gets knocked annually for playing just, the children of the poor in their conference. And I mean, does a 6'8" center who can jump out of the gym, like I would hope that he'd be good against those type of teams. But I think undersized guys like that, like at best, his upside is probably like Montrezl Harrell, which is a really good player and is probably the number one like energy type guy who gets by based on the fact that he just plays his ass off. But if that's your upside with, a pick, it's definitely more of a pick for now and not a pick for the future, because, post Blake 3-4 years from now, Brandon Clark's already 27 years old. So he's getting to the point where like, when does his athleticism start to fade a little bit? And then you kind of are stuck. Whereas Saku at that point is 22. And you're maybe seeing a guy who's really starting to blossom at that point.
Yeah, he's Montrezl Harrell or he's Derek Williams. So like you have to be okay with that. And we're not going to go down the Derek Williams train here, Joey Mack. We've had this conversation before. I was wrong. So let's talk. Let me take a quick break from our sponsor real quick, and then we'll get back to the trade scenario at 30. All right, and we're back. So I wanted to get back to the trade scenario that happened at 30. So I guess just to put it into just quickly here. So prior to the draft, as I said, Detroit had scooped the 30th pick in the Snell Lure trade. They then traded 30, which were the rights to Kevin Porter Jr. to Cleveland for 4 second rounders and $5 million cash. The second round picks were 2020, 2021, 2023, 2024. They then traded 2 of those newly acquired second round picks, the 2020 and 2021 pick, and their 45th pick in the draft with Dallas for the rights to the 37th pick, which ended up becoming Divides Servidis. So I might not be pronouncing that correctly, but that's fine. Who will likely, be stashed and will not be playing for Detroit this upcoming season. Brady, I know that you and I had agreed with this on the recent DBB on 3 on DetroitBadBoys.com. So if you want to just relay what your thoughts were after that whole sort of craziness happened on draft night.
So at 30, I wasn't sure what to expect, and like there were guys that were sitting there at that point who I was very starkly against at 15. Like Keldon Johnson, I wanted no part of at 15, but at 30, it's kind of like, wow, this guy sounds like it might be better. So I kind of came around on that idea a little bit. Then he got taken by San Antonio, and then looking at it again, I mean, the guys that were even on the board at that point, I mean, Kevin Porter Jr. would have been your second home run swing, which I think might have been a little bit too much. KZ Okpala was a guy that Laz really liked at DVB, but I wasn't super big on. He kind of just looked the part more than was the part. And then there were 2 guys who went later in the second round who I would have liked a lot more than Servidis, which is Eric Pascal, who went to Golden State, who's just like has the potential to be a PJ Tucker type player, and he's going to be good for you. And his ceiling's not high, but at 30, you're getting a useful player who's going to give you backup 3 and 4 minutes. And maybe he's kind of redundant with Siku, but who cares? You need talent. You're not that good, like you said. Or the other guy I kind of wanted was Talon Horton Tucker, who's from Iowa State, who I believe ended up going to the Lakers in a trade. And I think he'll end up actually like playing for them a little bit, but just a weird prospect. Like he's definitely a small forward, power forward, but he's only 6'4", but he has like a 7'3" wingspan and he can shoot some threes. So I would have rather taken a flyer on any of those guys than drafted a scrawny 3-point shooting prospect who's not going to come here for a year or 2, and maybe with Detroit's drafting acumen with European players in the past, I think the only guy they've ever taken in the second round who I think has come over and done well is probably Carlos Delfino, and that's like blast from the past long ago. That's Joe Dumars quality drafting. So I don't really
What
love
about
it.
Mehmet Okur?
Mehmet Okur was still before that though. Like Mehmet Okur was like 2002 though, so we're going even farther back for him. I mean, I think the last guy they drafted and stashed might have been, or they drafted, I think, or the last guy they brought over would have been Gigi Tatome, who was just terrible as well. So I mean,
I was like 30.
The track record is not very good, but different player.
Yeah. Joe, what were your thoughts? I know that Joe and I were on the phone with each other like, wait a minute, did we just draft Kevin Porter Jr.? Because like I don't remember seeing any trade happened. And it was like, he's going to Cleveland. It's like, so we were very confused at that moment. Because like Joe, I was also watching it at a bar. So that's a little glimpse into our lives. Joe, I guess, I know it was a lot to digest. There's a lot of like moving parts and stuff. But what were your thoughts about it? And I guess what are your thoughts with like the guy that we ended up selecting at that position?
Well, I selfishly wanted the 30th pick, just because you can get a better player at 30 than you can get at 38. And like, I don't know, it's a first rounder, and we haven't had 2 first rounders since we got Aaron Aflalo like 12 years ago, whatever it was. So that just makes it a little bit more exciting. And there were some players on the board that I wasn't necessarily excited about, but were mocked much higher than they ended up going. So I was conflicted with Kevin Porter Jr. I definitely didn't want him at 15. And there have been reports from like the Pistons camp that they just didn't believe in his overall character. which is fine. And that was a red flag for him going into the draft. And I was confused. I mean, when we got all of the second rounders, I didn't really know why, I didn't know when, so on and so forth. So I think at the end of the day, like reflecting on the trade, it makes sense because that's a guaranteed contract right off the bat, correct?
Yeah.
So now we don't have to pay that guaranteed contract in the first round, and we can get developmental players that don't, necessarily have to be on the roster year one. And looking at some of the tape on this guy, people have compared him to Luke Kennard. Luke Kennard's really good, or he's good. He's really good at certain things like shooting. So it's strange to compare like bad film in empty European stadiums to, an NBA player who's played well in the playoffs. But I do kind of see it. He's taller. He has he's a lefty. He has a really composed shot, which is something I've noticed off of Luke. He's sort of like, he takes his time, but it's quick. And in this guy, I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Davidis, he kind of shoots the same way. He can penetrate a little bit. He's a good shooter. The problem that I have with it is like draft and stash players, you don't necessarily like completely have your hands on him the entire time, so you can't develop him as much internally as you'd like to. You don't have to pay him, I believe, while they're playing in Europe, so that saves us money from a financial standpoint. It makes sense. My concern is that there are so many European players or international players, I guess, just in general, drafted in the second round that you just never hear about again. And I hope that we, didn't give up a first round pick for one of those guys. But based on the limited tape that I've seen, he does have some potential to be a shooter, and he has the size as well. So I guess we have to wait and see. Yeah.
I mean, I'm not very high on the pick. I'm not very high on the move. I do get it from a financial standpoint. Tom Gore has netted himself $5 million in cash. The cap space didn't take a hit because they're not, paying out the first round, contract, first round draft pick contract, even at 30, which is a little bit lower, but still, I understand it. There were a couple guys, I thought, honestly, it's like, that's take a swing on Kevin Porter Jr., take a swing on a Carson Edwards. Like, you have a hole at backup point guard, you have a hole.
So you would have rather taken Kevin Porter Jr. at the 30th.
Oh yeah, definitely. I would have rather gone that direction than what they ended up doing. And just the optics of it just aren't good in my opinion. I know that some of these picks aren't meant to convey, but just it's to trade for 4 second round picks and then to trade 2 of those second round picks plus 45 to move up 7 spots is just very strange to me. And honestly, it kind of just left a bad taste in my mouth. It screamed. I tweeted this on draft night. It just screamed doing too much. Like, and I don't believe that, this guy, Davidis Servidis, was like, quote unquote, their guy that they were like honed in on, that they had to like, get back into the mid to late 30s to scoop him. Because if you were that high on him as a player, you would have taken him at 30. You wouldn't have given it a chance for him to fall, the 7 spots that he did where you ended up selecting him. So like, I kind of like question Detroit's commitment to the player just because they could have picked him outright 7 picks early. They also, and I just question the general tactic of how the whole trade went down. And generally speaking, also, I'm just not very high on him as a player. He shot 46% from 3, which is great. 14 minutes per game. He's only 19 years old. He has time to mature. He might become a player, but I see him becoming at the very best like an Ersan Ilyasova, like a 3-point guy that has some crafty moves. Like, he looks like he could get to the cup a little bit. He was definitely a below the rim type of guy. Actually, Ersan can jump a little bit, or at least he used to be able to. And I don't know. I just don't necessarily see him being that impactful. I don't see him being as good as like an Ersan Ilyasova moving forward. I don't really see that type of development from him. And I agree with what Joe said. There's so many times where these guys, they get drafted and then they just disappear. So I just don't really, I don't know, I'm just not there for it. It's not a pick that I'm high on in general, and I'm not a pick of the moves that led up to it.
I wouldn't be surprised if he never ends up, coming over and doing anything. But like, hindsight, if he ends up coming over and he has a career like Ersan Ilyasova, you got a really good value in the second round if he has that type of an impact. But the only thing, and I'm not some sort of like EuroLeague expert by any means, but I just noticed the team that he played for was one that I had recognized, Ritas, the organization he's in, but he's on the Euro Cup team, so he's on there like the way it works over there, their varsity team. And that's a program that's pumped out, a guy named Srunas Salonis, who was a guy in the 90s who was good. Yasikevicius is another guy. I'm butchering these names. Played for the Warriors during their We Believe years, and he was a good backup point guard. And Jonas Valanciunas also came up through that system. So it's one of the higher level Lithuanian teams over there. So it's not as much like he's just in the hands of some random team in the country of Georgia, which makes it slightly better to know that at least he's playing with a high level professional team, whereas he's not just kind of getting slightly bigger and just doing the same stuff with some middling team. If that makes it any better, I don't know. I still don't know that he'll be any good, but if he comes over and can be a 3-point shooter and help us, then that's good. But if not, then I wouldn't be surprised either.
Yeah, I mean, I saw the Euro Cup stuff too, and that did give me some sort of hope, some optimism, and he's playing at their highest league. So, it's tough to tell. It's tough to tell. Excuse me. It's tough to tell when guys are getting 14 minutes per game and they have small sample sizes and they're 19 years old, like how good of a player they are. It's like there's so limited information. There's limited tape. There's just limits to how much I can understand about this guy as a player. I mean, he's 6'8" and he's got a 6'7" wingspan. That's something that's never like the most positive when it comes to the sort of profile. But at the same time, and I was saying that, like, I was giving Ersan Ilyasova love. I think Ersan has been a great NBA player, and I just see like that being the absolute peak of who he is. And if he does hit that, I mean, obviously that would be great. But I just don't necessarily see it. But as I just said, so much limited time, so much limited tape, so much limited information on this guy, and he hasn't played that much in his professional career. So, there's so much more to learn about this guy that it's kind of hard for us to tell right now. So I think Joe had some technical difficulties, but we'll get him back on here soon. I guess before we do, let's just take one last break, and then we can talk about the third pick in the draft and see if we can get a little free agency talk in. All right, so we'll be right back. Sorry, Brady. I'm just trying to get Joe back in here.
No, you're fine. I saw he dropped out, and I didn't realize when, but it was somewhere between the last two takes. But yeah, I did see he disappeared.
He's saying that he isn't allowed back in. Let me just see if I can do this real quick. God damn it, Joe. Well, this is good. At least it's on a break, and then he can edit this because it's his turn. So wait, you said you were starting a podcast?
Yeah, we kind of started one. My buddy from like childhood and stuff started one. We recorded it on Sunday. I haven't really pushed it out yet because I don't know that it's good. I'm still waiting for some people to listen to it and be like, hey, this doesn't suck. One of my coworkers today said it was okay. So that kind of gave me hope too. But it's like, yeah, we didn't want to stick to just sports because sports is such like a flooded market. Like every freaking guy in the world has a podcast about sports. So like it's mostly just stuff, and like a lot of the guys that I grew up with are interested in things outside of just like basketball or whatever. So like it's kind of just a show about stuff, and we'll see how long it lasts. And but like I said, the app we use is so simple that I just literally sit here for a half hour, we talk, and then I have to put the intro and the close, and then I click post and it's done. So that actually makes it a lot less daunting than like having to actually layer audio and go through all the hoops that an actual podcast would have to go through.
Yeah, that's not bad. I mean, so when you say stuff, like, do you mean like culture, movies, like
yeah, I think we did. So we did
politics?
no politics. So we did like a draft review free agency type thing on Sunday. And then that one just the podcast just got added to Spotify today. I think they emailed me and said that was on Spotify, so that's kind of cool. And then
Nice.
next week we're gonna do something about Stranger Things, since season 3 of that show comes back on the 4th of July.
Oh, it does. Yeah, I know they're going to be basing it like it's going to be a summer theme, right? Like they're
Yeah, it's like summer theme, and they put the episodes at the same time, so people are going to be done with it by the end of that holiday weekend. So like, if we can record something before that, people could sit there and get a half hour of their little catch up, and then boom, they're ready to consume the entire thing in one bite.
So what's your method of like getting it out there to the people?
I'm still trying to figure that out. So I don't know the best route, and I don't know that like what the audience is yet, and we're still
Yeah.
trying to figure that out between because like Twitter. I mean, I have a shitload of Twitter followers, but like, do they care? I don't know. Maybe I mean, I'll definitely put it out that way,
Yeah, you got to at least do that.
and then like Instagram, I think on my own, just like personal one, like people I know who are my friends might listen to it, so like that might grab the attention of a few people, and then Facebook, like for my journalism days, I have so many like Facebook groups that are like, or Facebook pages that are like Brady Frederickson journalists or whatever. And I might just take that page, which has a couple hundred followers, and just rebrand it as the podcast, and then just like inherit all of those.
They're like, wait, what is
like,
this? What did I follow?
Just redo it. So that might be what I do. I don't know. Yeah, I'm still trying to kind of figure it out. And I mean, we're still so early that you can kind of just let it ride and then figure it out as we go. But yeah, I don't know.
You can also like reply to what might be a good idea is like if you do like it might be better for you if you make your own Twitter page for it.
Yeah.
That way if you want to like reply to like the HBO show, like, hey, like here's our show, like talking about this. Like, they're tweeting about it. Not HBO, but Netflix. Tweet. Exactly. Right. And it's like someone might see it.
That's smart. I never thought about that. It's
a way to actually like target the audience that you're looking for.
That's true.
So I don't know what the hell Joe is doing right now because I'm trying to message him on Facebook, but we can just keep this going without him, honestly, and just say that we lost him. Honestly.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, I have but like one thought on Jordan Bone, and it's that I don't think he's any good. And then I've got like 9 free agent names or 8 free agent names that like we don't have to dive into, but just are guys that I would like to see them target. And that's about it.
Yeah, this is going to be the quicker part. So let's just run with this, and I'll just say that we lost Joe.
All right, it works. Yeah.
All right. Well, we are back, and unfortunately, Joey Mack and everyone at home, I know you're probably having a beer whenever you're listening to this, even if it's on your commute in to work. But pour one out for Joe. He's not coming back on this episode. He's been having some tech issues today. So
all right, well, Joe's gone, so I'm gonna leave too. I'll see you, David. Bye.
All right, see you later. Actually, Laz has done that. He's done like his own show, and it's like I don't know if I could even do that. I don't think I have the ability, even though I dominate the mic too much as is. But that's a skill set to be able to talk on your own.
Oh yeah, it's tough. I mean, I always think of like radio guys do that, and I can't imagine that being your job every day for 4 hours just to talk and hear your voice. I couldn't do it. I'd love to say I could, but I don't think I could like handle myself and all of my takes.
That's why like Colin Cowherd's head got so big. It's like he only talks to himself, so it's just like a literal echo chamber for himself.
When I said what I just said, I was actually thinking of Colin Cowherd, which is pretty funny.
Yeah, he's something else. And I wouldn't want to become him. So, but anyway, actually, he's making bank. I would give a shit. I would love to. That would be awesome. Just wouldn't want his takes, I guess you could say. But now we're some equally spicy takes here. Jordan Bone, the 57th pick in the draft, selected out of the University of Tennessee. He was a junior there. I believe in his junior season, he averaged 13.5 points, 5.8 assists, 3.2 boards, 47% from floor, 36% from three. Brady, you were saying while we were on break there that you're not too much of a fan. Can you go into why?
I think he was a late bloomer in college. He wasn't very good his first 2 years, and I will say, Tennessee coach Rick Barnes has produced a lot of NBA players, and he's got a knack for guys to find their way into the league and stick. But I don't know, Bone can't shoot. He's athletic in that he's quick and fast, but he's not vertically athletic like you'd traditionally think of as a basketball player. And I just think he's going to be a guy who maybe at best his ceiling is like Ish Smith, which would be nice, but we know the flaws that come with Ish. And I think he's just going to be a really fun player to watch for Grand Rapids Drive fans.
Well, I mean, I think that says it all right there about him, about your feelings about him.
I mean, I think the thing is too, though, and maybe this is something that will come up because last year, the team got lucky with Reggie Jackson playing 82 games, but I mean, depending on which we'll get into in a sec, I guess who they have as a backup point guard. I mean, if Bone can go out there and run the floor and just play the same style as Ish, even if he's not good at it, like maybe he can give an impact if they really need him. But I can't imagine he's that much better than like past third string guards they've had like Dwight Bikes or anything like that.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. Especially, it'd be tough, even though he is a little bit older than, he is a junior coming in to the NBA. That he's still going to naturally struggle, just getting up into pace or just finding himself in NBA pace, understanding, defensive schemes, understanding what they're trying to do to him. So I do think that there is a chance that he does get some run, especially if Detroit doesn't adequately address their backup situation. It might not even take a Reggie Jackson injury. It might just take futility at the backup spot in order for him to get a look in Detroit. But what I was able to gather from watching his tape was, he had a nice little mid-range game. I didn't. People had mentioned that he was like an Ish Smith, and he is extremely fast. I mean, there's only one Ish Smith that I can think of pretty much ever. Like, there's only one guy like mouse in the house when it comes to his ability to sort of find his way super deep into the paint and make something productive out of that and make as long of a career as he's had and as successful as a career as Ish Smith has had, considering all of the things he has going against him. Also, Ish Smith is a guy that is pretty vertically impressive. He's like 6'1", and when he actually gets a lane and can throw it down, Ish Smith can get up there. I was a little concerned seeing Jordan Bone not really have too many dunks. Like, most of his attempts were layups once he got into the paint, but he had a nice little floater. He had a nice little mid-range game. So I think there's a chance that there's an NBA player in there. And honestly, I'm just happy that even though it's the 57th pick in a reported weak draft class, we'll see whatever these guys become. But I was happy just that Detroit did pick up a point guard. Like, I do think that there's value in there, in the sense of like, hey, let's see what we got in this guy. Just knowing that there's, after Reggie Jackson is gone after next season, like, there's literally no future that you can point to when it comes to the point guard position in Detroit. So even though it's a flyer, even though, it's not necessarily, he's not going to be a crazy impact player next year. Just the fact that they were able to address a point guard in some fashion, even if it's just a hope, I was happy with that. And I don't think he's going to be a terrible player. I think he'll be around the league for a few years.
He's going to be easy to root for because I don't know if you've seen it or if anybody listening has seen this video of his draft party. And I've covered draft parties. Like, I covered a guy named Tony Bradley down in Florida, and he plays for the Jazz now. And I've covered those draft parties where you get like a space and you have a bunch of friends and family around, and how tense it gets as guys start to fall. And you get to that second round area where there's no guarantees. And for Bone, he got down to, what was it, pick 57, and there's this video floating around of his brother kind of sitting on stage with him saying, we're so sad about this, but we're going to be better. And it's a very, very, very like dull and like emotional moment. And then all of a sudden the TV behind them, they're not even watching, flashes and he gets drafted, and the entire crowd of people in this room just bum rush Jordan Bone and tackle him, and they're just so happy. And it was just such a 0 to 100 moment that that kind of made it easier to root for the guy, knowing that like he's sitting there staring at being undrafted, and then in a matter of a snap of the fingers he's on his way to a team, and everyone around him is just celebrating. That was pretty cool to see.
Yeah, I mean, that was awesome. It's kind of one of those like pull at your heartstrings moment, especially just because it's his brother doing it up there for him, and kind of taking on the hit, the hit on the chin with them, and everyone kind of caught an L up until that moment, and then all of a sudden just jubilation erupted as soon as he was selected. So yeah, definitely rooting for the guy. And as I said, I do think there will be opportunity for him to get a little bit of run at some point here in the next year. So I'm not mad at the pick, and I gave it a B, I believe, on Detroit Bad Boys, and I do think that there's an NBA player in there. So, but let's move on to free agency. Excuse me. I had mentioned that Detroit has a glaring hole at the backup free agency spot, or at the backup point guard spot. They have a glaring hole at the backup center position, and I guess whatever you want to consider the backup power forward position, that's also an area of need. So they definitely have some holes to fill, and they only have about $12 million total to address those. I think 9.6 in the mid-level exception, and then also 3.2 in like the biannual exception. Are my numbers correct on that, Brady? I don't know if you have that pulled up.
That sounds right, yeah, because they did lose a few $1 million when they got Tony Snell, but overall that is the ballpark number right there, yeah.
Are there any names out there that you are targeting that could be possible solutions at one of the many spots that Detroit has needs at?
Yeah, I have like a list of guys that I like, and obviously these are not names that you can pair and say, well, this guy and this guy, or this guy and this guy. I mean, for the point guard stuff, a popular name has been Seth Curry, who obviously, with that bloodline and with what he's done in the NBA, a great shooter, really good scorer. I'm not sure how good he would be as a primary ball handler, and if you bring in a Seth Curry who's not going to be creating for others like Ish Smith was, I think you need to have more shot creation on your bench to make that happen. But I think he'd be a good fit, and he definitely would be able to step in with those starters and give them good support minutes there. Darren Collison's another point guard who, I've always really liked his game. He's just steady. He's a Pistons killer, so it'd be great to get him on the other side of that. And I'm not sure how much he's going to cost now, but I think he would be super steady, and he gives you the playmaking, the floor leadership, and also the ability to hit threes. And the other guy that I haven't really seen mentioned as a point guard that I think, and he's a restricted free agent, so there's the possibility that the Wizards could reach out and keep him, but knowing their salary cap situation with John Wall and all of their disgusting mess of a cap space, they don't necessarily have room to splurge like this. But Tomas Satoransky is a guy who really got a lot of run with John Wall out this year, and he was really good for them. He's a good shooter. He's a little older at 27 years old. He's a veteran of the European game, so he's played over there. And I mean, this year he averaged 9 points and 5 assists in 27 minutes a game, and I think those numbers were even better over the course of his time as a starter, closer to like 12 points and 7 assists with good 3-point shooting. So he's a guy that I definitely think would be able to step in, give them minutes at both point guard and shooting guard, because he's 6'7", and I think that would be really good if they could find a way to lure him away from Washington. I just don't know how aggressive Washington would be in terms of trying to match a deal with him.
Yeah, and he's a guy that can kind of explode too for points. Like, he's had some big games in the NBA. It's not just like he's like as we were talking about earlier, like a Tony Snell, where he's pretty much going to get you anywhere between 5 and 10 points any given night. I've seen some games out of Satoransky where he's really gone off and caught fire. And I believe I saw one in Detroit when he played against the Pistons this past year. So I mean, that's not a guy that I had circled, but definitely a guy that I wouldn't be opposed to if Detroit was able to lure him away from Washington.
Yeah, and I think there's just the list of guys. If you go through the list of point guards and try and find who makes the most sense, there's a lot of times where guys are good but not great, or you don't want to overpay for somebody. So I mean, you kind of have to pick your spots and find guys who have some upside, and maybe playing in a bigger role like that would help them. And you're either going to get Satoransky, who I think maybe could be better in Detroit, or a Darren Collison, who I think his game is only going to keep going down as he gets older.
Yeah, but he's also not a guy that relies 100% on his athleticism. He's a guy that is a good shooter, and he is a guy that started a lot in his career. Should you decide to move on from Reggie Jackson and Darren Collison, that's what I'm talking about. But another couple of guys that I had mentioned, or that I had noted, and I don't know, a lot of this is speculative because we don't know what the market's going to bear for these guys. We don't know how much Detroit is willing to pay their backup point guard position compared to what they're looking at for their backup center. Ed Stefanski had noted that he's looking to pay the mid-level exception in its entirety to a singular player. He mentioned that $9 million is not a lot of money to spend. So it looks like he's going, and I would assume just based on importance in the position in today's NBA that you would be targeting the point guard over the backup center if you're going to be giving someone the entire mid-level exception. So for those reasons, a couple guys that stuck out to me that you haven't mentioned, I had written down Seth Curry, I had written down Darren Collison, but in this is a guy that's also a restricted free agent, so it depends on how highly the Warriors think about him. But Quinn Cook is a guy that I've been able to watch, over the course of the last couple of years. He's a guy that made his way in from the G League and had quite a bit of run in the playoffs. I think maybe out of need with all the injuries that they've had, but he's been I don't necessarily know how much the Warriors are going to be able to pay guys that aren't Klay Thompson. I don't know how their money might get tied up early with offer sheets that are on the table. And, that might be a sort of decision-making process for Quinn Cook. At the same time, he definitely could make a little bit more. I'm not necessarily sure what his value is or how the rest of the league values him. He's a good shooter. He's a good facilitator. And he's a confident player. And he looks like a guy that could possibly step into a starting role if he was given that opportunity. Another guy, Austin Rivers. I've always been, not necessarily on Austin Rivers Island. I think I bought like a little bit of property, like in like an archipelago, like this past couple of years. But that's another guy that's a free agent this year. He's defensively, he's one of the better point guards in the league. He was the backup point guard for Chris Paul. He played mostly off ball in Houston, but so does everyone else when James Harden is on the floor. And then lastly, Corey Joseph, the other guy from Indiana. I've always been a really big Corey Joseph fan. He's not the best shooter, but he is like a traditional point guard floor general that gets other guys involved. And he is a capable scorer when he gets an opportunity to shoot. But that's another guy on the point guard list that I'm eyeing that I definitely wouldn't be mad at if he found his way to Detroit this year.
Yeah, that's kind of that list of specifically Corey Joseph's a guy who has the connection to Dwayne Casey, and he's the kind of player that if that's who they end up with, if that's like the worst case, you can deal with that because that's a guy who isn't going to cost you an arm and a leg, who definitely plays defense. We know he'll bring that. He's not a prolific shooter, but he can make the shots like you said. And I think he's just steady. And that's kind of the low upside, the high ceiling or high floor type of guy. Whereas Quinn Cook, you're right. I have thought about him and he didn't play very well in the finals, but he was again tossed into a weird spot where he was just basically out there to fill Klay Thompson's role, and that's kind of not his game, I guess. But he's also, if you think, he was at Duke a long time ago. He's 27 years old almost now, so he's not a spring chicken. So he's a guy that if he's going to get his chance, he's got to get it now. And I don't know. It kind of again feels a little bit like a poor man's Seth Curry type of move, where it's a guy who can shoot and who can score. But I just don't know that I have the confidence that he's going to be able to run that bench unit and get things going, which, as we saw this year, when Ish Smith doesn't play, the bench is just a black hole of bad. So the guy who's in there in the back needs to be able to get that thing moving because, who knows what's going to be coming off the bench this year, but they need a guy who can do more than just shoot or more than score, which is kind of my concern with both Cook and Curry.
Yeah, that's fair. And I think one thing to note, and I think this should put things in perspective a little bit in what you have in a Reggie Jackson, or at least what you have had historically. And when you look at Reggie Jackson's career in totality, like Quinn Cook, he's a guy that might excite a lot of people. And I just mentioned I wouldn't mind him in Detroit by any means, but he's not a player that will ever reach what Reggie Jackson was able to reach throughout his career. Like the type of player that Reggie was, where he was like a bona fide starter for at least a couple seasons before all of the injury problems that he had, like a 40-point per game, not 40-point per game, excuse me, but a 40-point game type of score that had that type of electricity. The guys that we're going over right now have historically not been that type of player. So I think it does kind of put things in perspective. It's like, yeah, I know everyone thinks Reggie is trash, but like you really do have to question if some of these guys will be able to take things in the starting lineup should Detroit end up moving on from Reggie Jackson, because he is a more accomplished player, at least when it comes to like his personal statistics, his personal his seasons that he's had historically. But he's also a guy that has a little bit more versatility in his game than a lot of the guys that we just mentioned.
No, I agree.
Any centers that you've eyed up?
Yeah, this list is a lot shorter and not quite as fun. I'll start with the more expensive guys. I think JaMychal Green. I've always liked his game with Memphis, and they traded him to the Clippers this year. He's a big guy who is 6'9", rebounds the ball decently. Isn't a great defender, but he's good enough. But he stretches the floor. He can shoot the three. I think having a backup five that can shoot the three really opens things up and allows you to play, potentially play JaMychal Green next to Andre Drummond, which would be, give you another flexible roster spot that maybe, I think Green is better than Thon Maker too. But also, Blake Griffin next to a 3-point shooting center is always a good thing too, just because it gives him more space to operate. So, he's probably my number one target, and that would be the flip flop, kind of the inverse. So like you get a JaMychal Green for $9 million a year, which I think is close to what he made this year. You'd probably be looking at more of a Corey Joseph at point guard. So it depends on. I think that's also another conversation. Entirely another conversation is, do you commit more money to the big or to the point? But so JaMychal Green's number one. Kenneth Faried's a guy who was like on the verge of washing out of the league. It seemed like went to Houston, magically became really really useful again. I kind of look at that with a little bit of concern because he wouldn't be the first guy to go play for Mike D'Antoni and really kind of look good again. So that
was like hitting corner threes too.
I know.
What is he doing hitting corner threes right now?
We hadn't seen him play in so long. There's definitely a possibility he just got better, but that's a guy who I don't know how much it's going to cost, but I know he's going to bring energy and he's going to play hard, and you're going to get a guy who can rebound there. And the third guy, and I think we've talked about this in the past, is the Celtics third string center. So Daniel Tice was a guy who I had zero clue who he was when they brought him over. He's not super huge. He's built like a power forward. He's thin, but his game just works. He's really good defensively. He's just a team defender. He can shoot the three a little bit. He shot 38% this year. But if he played 14 minutes a game for Boston this year, averaged 6 points and 3 rebounds, shot 55%, hit 30% of his threes, and he's not a shot blocker or really a guy who comes with steals, but he's just in the right spot, and the team plays better defensively when he's out there and offensively too. That's the kind of guy that's going to come for cheap, and he's going to fit, and he's not going to be glitzy, and people are going to be like, who the hell is this guy? But I could see that being one of those signings where, I know the Pistons paid a bit more than people wanted for Aaron Baines, and that ended up being a good signing, but he could be one of those guys who, like Aaron Baines, played a really small role on a good team, came to Detroit and kind of got a little bit more freedom and kind of played a little better. So Tice is the guy that I really think I would like to see them go for him as the center and then commit the big chunk of that money to, whoever at that point guard that kind of fits their need for them right now.
I want to just back that up 110%. Daniel Tice is good. He's a good basketball player. He has a surprising, like he can jump a little bit. He's got a good stroke. He's on the floor where he's supposed to be. He's just a guy he's just a really good basketball player, and people don't know him because he was like, the second or third string center on the Celtics, but he got a good amount of run. There was a lot of games this year where Aaron Baines was unavailable, and Tice was thrusted into that sort of backup center lineup or backup center minutes. I would be ecstatic if Detroit was able to get Daniel Tice, and you mentioned it. I haven't really thought about this list when it comes to like 3-point spacing fives. I was more so thinking like I can't watch Zaza and Thon out there. I was just like, I need somebody with a little bit more movement or strength, or movement and strength, because I guess you got a little bit of movement in Thon and you have strength in Zaza, but just not a good combo. A guy that I like is Robin Lopez. I don't know how much he's going to command.
Not gonna happen. He wants that guy. That guy was stuck in Chicago all
Contender.
year. He's
Yeah.
going somewhere where he can be, on a contender. Because I think with the funny thing about Robin Lopez is he's such like BFFs with Brooke that like I bet you, and knowing he's also kind of a hothead, like I'm guaranteeing you that guy was watching the playoffs being like, how the hell am I not playing for a championship right now where Brooks just out there balling out in the playoffs and I'm stuck here with these baby bulls who don't know what they're doing.
That's fair. Yeah, I mean, I guess you're right. I doubt that he would want to come to Detroit,
He'd be a
and I
great
don't
fit, though. He'd be a
necessarily
great
blame
fit.
him. Rashawn Holmes, he's a guy that and bounced around the league a little bit. I think he was last in Phoenix.
Yeah.
But he's strong. He's a rim runner. He can get rebounds. There's just elements to his game that just fit in nicely, and you can simplify the game for him. You don't need to expect a ton, but he's going to be at least a better defensive presence out there than what you had in Zaza. A guy that, I don't know. I mean, I know we had mentioned Taj Gibson in the group chat in Detroit Bad Boys. I like him in his sense of, he can hit a little bit of a mid-range game. He's strong. He's, he can still finish, at the rim. He's just a guy that is a good basketball player, and I think would help this team and sort of stabilize that second unit. I know that I think that James Edwards for The Athletic had written that he'd expect him to get most of the mid-level exception money, like around $9 million. And if that was the case, then I would completely be 100% off him. Hard pass at that figure. But if it was more like that flip that we were talking about, where you're able to get a point guard at a more of a premium and get him more on that sort of secondary contract, then that'd be a move that I'd be okay with. So, I mean, those are just some names that we have out there for you. But, Detroit's going to be able to do a little bit more than last year when it comes to the players that they're bringing in. And that should be a positive. And, hopefully they're able to build on, I think this whole podcast theme, this episode's theme is like, while I know a lot of people seem confused about this team's strategy, I think it's pretty clear what they're trying to do. They're trying to, I think Mike Snyder, our writer for Detroit Bad Boys, had said this well. He's like, they're trying to win now. They're not trying to compete now. Like, they're not trying to compete for a championship and lie to themselves that that's where they're at. But they're still trying to win now, and that doesn't mean that you can't plan for the future like they did with some of these draft selections. So yeah. I'm happy with the way that things are going, and I'm happy with, I think that this is going to be a more exciting free agency period than we saw last year. So all in all, after this past week of acquisitions and trades and draft selections and things of that nature, I'm happy with where this team is currently constructed and where they're going moving forward.
Yeah, I think they have an idea of what they want to do, I think, and that's half the battle. And, as long as they don't just go out and, the Pistons have been a team specifically under Stan Van Gundy that, made their moves on day one. So, I mean, if we are sitting there on Sunday night and it's 10 o'clock and we've already heard that they are, SOL and out of their money, that might not be the best thing, because the longer you wait, you do find guys that see their value depreciate a little bit and you get those better deals. And I think that'd be the smart money to do with those big guys, which I think we're in agreement there. Pay for the point guard and, kind of fill the center spot as you can. But I think if they wait on that, that will be better for both impact financially, and also maybe they'll find, maybe there's a guy who we're not even talking about who just cannot find the deal he wants and, looks at it and says, hell, let's go play with Blake Griffin. That's fine, whatever. And that's what we end up with. And that'd work out pretty good too.
I completely agree. I think that's a good way of putting it. As long as they don't, go back into the hard capping their situation or hard capping their cap for Langston Galloway like they did a couple of years ago. So, I think there's a lot to build off of here. But, well, Brady, thank you so much for joining me and earlier Joe today. If you wanted to shout out where the people can find you one more time, feel free.
Yeah, for sure. Obviously there's some words at Detroit Bad Boys, and then you can follow me on Twitter at Brady BRADY _FRED.
Well, and you can follow this podcast on at Inside the CYLNDR on Twitter. This is your boy, David Fernandez. I'm also over at Detroit Bad Boys. I owe an article of some sort to the website at some point. It's been a minute. I need to get, the keyboard fingers working here, but keep an eye. I'm sure there'll be something here soon. But again, Brady, thanks for joining us. And let's get this free agency period going.
I'm excited for it. Let's do it.
All right, man. Well, take care.